The Einherjar Protocol, a record of the Prometheus Navigator Research Institute Dark Age of Technology, M23. We diagnosed what we could not name. We regulated what we could not understand. We opened every door while insisting there was nothing on the other side. In the end, we did not summon them. We invited them in, filled out the proper forms, and asked them to sign the guest registry. Recovered fragment, attributed to director Yolanda Ferris, Prometheus Institute. Final Days, Part 1, The Rational Order, Chapter 1. The Institute, the Prometheus Navigator Research Institute, occupied a sprawling complex on the fourth moon of Aldrin's Reach, a world so distant from Sol that Earth was merely another point of light in the crowded sky. The facility had been constructed over 3 centuries, growing from a modest observation post into a labyrinthine structure of laboratories, containment wings, residential blocks, and research annexes that housed over 12,000 personnel and nearly 400 navigator subjects. From the observation deck of the administrative spire, Senior Research Director Yolanda Ferris could see the entire complex spread out beneath her, a testament to human ambition and the boundless resources of the Earth omnistate. The buildings gleamed in the pale light of the gas giant around which the moon orbited, their surfaces reflecting the swirling storms of that massive world like mirrors catching the patterns of chaos. She had spent 47 years at Prometheus, rising from a junior cognitive analyst to the highest research position in the facility. In that time, she had overseen thousands of studies, approved hundreds of protocols, and signed her name to more papers than she could remember. Her work had helped refine navigator training procedures across human space, had contributed to the development of safer warp transit corridors, had pushed the boundaries of human understanding of the immaterium further than any previous generation. And yet, standing here in the quiet hours of the station's night cycle, she could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. It had started small, a pattern in the incident reports, a clustering of anomalies that should have been random but weren't. Over the past 18 months, cases of what the medical division called temporal psychogenic dissociative disorder had increased by 300%. The containment wing was filling with subjects who reported hallucinations, voices, impossible knowledge of events they could not have witnessed. The psychological support staff were overwhelmed, and 3 of them had themselves been transferred to observation after exhibiting similar symptoms. The official explanation was stress. The expansion of the Navigator Enhancement Program had pushed everyone to their limits, and stress responses were expected. The brain, after all, was a complex organ, and prolonged exposure to the energies involved in warp perception could produce all manner of neurological artifacts. That was the rational explanation. That was what the reports said, what the medical staff believed, what the Earth government's regulatory bodies had accepted without question. But Yolanda had been in this field too long to believe in simple explanations. She turned from the window as the door to her office chimed. "Enter!" The man who stepped through was Dr. Cassius Thorne, head of the Cognitive Anomalies Division, and one of the few researchers at Prometheus whose experience rivaled her own. He was tall and thin, with the perpetually exhausted look of someone who spent too much time staring at data that refused to make sense. His gray hair was disheveled, his coat wrinkled, his eyes carrying the weight of sleepless nights. "Director, you asked to see the latest integration reports." "I did." She gestured to the seat across from her desk, settling into her own chair as Thorne placed a data tablet between them. "Summary, concerning." Thorne's voice was carefully neutral, the tone of a scientist who had learned to separate his emotions from his observations. The newborn subjects are progressing faster than projected. Consciousness transfer protocols are achieving 73% stability in the latest cohort, up from 51% last quarter. That sounds like good news. It would be, if not for the secondary data. Thorne pulled up a new display, filling the air between them with holographic charts and graphs. Post-integration psychological profiles show anomalies that don't match our baseline models. Subjects report memories they shouldn't have, experiences from other subjects, knowledge of events occurring in other parts of the facility, even apparent foreknowledge of scheduled procedures. Shared information networks. Some form of residual psychic bleed from the integration process. That's what we assumed initially, but the pattern doesn't fit. The information isn't flowing between subjects. It's appearing in subjects who have had no contact with each other, no shared integration chambers, no common personnel. Thorne paused, his jaw tightening. And some of the information isn't coming from anywhere inside the facility at all. Yolanda leaned forward. Explain. Subject 447 row reported detailed knowledge of a shipping accident in the Arcturus sector, an accident that occurred 3 days after the integration procedure that produced those memories. Subject 512 Gamma described the contents of a sealed research archive on Earth that no one at this facility has ever accessed. Subject 623 Delta. He stopped, his composure cracking for just a moment. Subject 623 Delta described my daughter's birthday party. In detail, including the gift I gave her, the words I spoke, the color of the decorations. My daughter lives on Earth, Director. Her birthday was 6 days ago. I haven't spoken to anyone about it. Silence fell over the office. Outside the window, the storms of the gas giant continued their eternal dance, indifferent to the small concerns of the humans who watched them. TPDD, Yolanda said finally. Temporal desynchronization. The subject's consciousness is experiencing temporal. With respect, Director, that's a label, not an explanation. Thorne's voice was harder now, the careful neutrality giving way to something more desperate. We've been using TPDD to classify every anomaly we can't understand, but the classification doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't explain how a subject can know things that haven't happened yet, or things that are happening light years away, or things that exist only in the private thoughts of other people. The warp. The warp is a natural phenomenon. That's what we're taught, what we tell ourselves, what the government mandates we believe. Natural phenomena don't read minds. They don't predict the future. They don't. He stopped himself, taking a breath, forcing his features back into professional composure. Forgive me, I'm tired. The data is troubling, that's all. Yolanda studied him for a long moment. She had known Cassius Thorne for 20 years, had watched him navigate the most disturbing discoveries with unwavering scientific detachment. She had never seen him like this. What do you think is happening, Cassius? He didn't answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I think we're being watched. I think something is watching us through our subjects, through our experiments, through every breach we make into the immaterium. And I think it's learning. Learning what? How to get in. The words hung in the recycled air between them. Yolanda wanted to dismiss them, to offer a rational explanation, to retreat into the comfortable certainty of the scientific framework that had defined her entire career. But she couldn't, because somewhere in the back of her mind, in the place where instinct lived and logic feared to tread, she had been thinking the same thing for months. Keep monitoring, she said finally. Document everything. And Cassius, don't share your theories with anyone else. Not yet. You believe me. I believe something is happening that our current models can't explain, whether that something is what you think it is. She turned back to the window, to the swirling storms and the distant stars. "I hope you're wrong. I hope we're both wrong." But she didn't sound hopeful. She sounded like a woman who had seen the shape of something terrible forming on the horizon and who knew that no amount of hoping would make it go away. Thorn gathered his materials and left. The door closed behind him with a soft hiss, and Yolanda was alone again with the silence and the stars. She stood at the window for a long time, watching the patterns in the gas giant's atmosphere, looking for meaning in the chaos. She found none, but somewhere in the facility below, in laboratories and containment cells and the quiet spaces between thoughts, something was watching her in return. Something that had been watching for a very long time, and it was smiling. Chapter 2, The Diagnosis, the Cognitive Anomalies Division, occupied the eastern wing of Research Block 7, a sprawling complex of laboratories, observation chambers, and interview rooms where the stranger manifestations of navigator exposure were studied and theoretically explained. Dr. Myra Okonkwo walked beside Dr. Thorne through the facility's corridors, her dark eyes taking in every detail with the practiced attention of a scientist accustomed to finding meaning in minutiae. She was 43 years old, her black hair cropped close to her skull, her face carrying the composed expression of someone who had learned long ago to hide her reactions behind a mask of professional neutrality. She had been brought in from the Cognitive Sciences Institute on Mars, recruited specifically for her expertise in neural mapping and consciousness studies. Her reputation preceded her, rigorous, methodical, skeptical of claims that couldn't be quantified and replicated. If anyone could make sense of the anomalies plaguing Prometheus, it was her. At least, that was what she had told herself on the long journey here. Now, walking through corridors that hummed with energies she couldn't quite identify, past doors marked with warning symbols she didn't fully understand, she was beginning to wonder if sense was something this place had abandoned long ago. "This is the intake ward," Thorne said, gesturing to a row of sealed doors with small observation windows. "New cases are evaluated here before being assigned to appropriate treatment protocols. We're currently processing about 40 new admissions per week, triple our average from 2 years ago. What's driving the increase? If we knew that, Dr. Okonkwo, we wouldn't need outside consultants." There was no hostility in his voice, only exhaustion. "The official position is that expanded research programs create expanded stress responses. More navigator enhancement procedures, more exposure to warp-adjacent phenomena, more opportunities for cognitive disruption." "And the unofficial position?" Thorne stopped walking. They had reached a junction in the corridor, and he turned to face her directly. In the harsh, fluorescent light, she could see how deeply the lines were carved into his face, how hollow his eyes had become. "The unofficial position is that something is wrong. Not with our procedures, not with our subjects, but with something fundamental that we've refused to examine, because examining it would require us to question everything we think we know." He resumed walking before she could respond, leading her deeper into the facility. They passed laboratories filled with equipment she didn't recognize, observation rooms where technicians monitored readouts that made no sense to her, and finally reached a heavy door marked restricted access. Level 7 clearance required. "There's something I need to show you," Thorne said as he entered his authorization code. "Something that isn't in any of the official files." The door opened onto another observation chamber, but this one was different from the others. The subject inside wasn't sitting placidly in a comfortable chair. He was strapped to a reinforced frame, his wrists and ankles bound with restraints designed for the most violent patients. A thick blindfold covered his eyes, and sensors attached to his skull fed data to monitors that lined the walls. Navigator First Class Vorian Keth, Thorne explained. 15 years of service, impeccable record, no history of psychological instability. 3 weeks ago, he opened his third eye during a routine calibration exercise. Navigators open their third eyes constantly. It's how they perceive the warp for transit calculations. Yes, but this time something looked back. He activated the chamber's recording system, pulling up footage from 3 weeks prior. The holographic display showed Vorian sitting in the same chair, unbound, his manner calm and professional. A technician was adjusting sensors around his head, and the navigator's face showed nothing but routine concentration. Beginning third eye calibration, the recorded Vorian announced. His voice was steady, professional. Opening in 3, 2, 1. His forehead seemed to split open. Not literally, the skin remained intact, but something beneath it parted, revealing the navigator's warp eye. It was a mutation unique to their kind. A third eye that allowed them to perceive the immaterium directly, to see the currents and eddies of that strange dimension and guide ships through its treacherous depths. The eye glowed with a pale, sickly light. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then Vorian began to scream. The sound was unlike anything Myra had ever heard, a shriek that seemed to contain multiple voices, as if something was screaming through him rather than with him. His body convulsed against the chair, foam flecking his lips. His normal eyes rolling back to show the whites, while his third eye blazed with light that hurt to look at even in the recording. "They're here," he howled, and his voice broke into registers that human vocal cords shouldn't have been able to produce. "They've always been here. Oh God, they're so beautiful, they're so hungry, they're looking at me, they're looking at all of us." The technicians in the recording rushed to sedate him, but before they could reach him, Vorian's voice changed. It dropped several octaves, becoming something that vibrated in Myra's chest even through the recording equipment. Something that made her hind brain scream warnings that her conscious mind couldn't interpret. "Little seer," it said, and the words seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls and floor and sailing from the air itself. "Little eye in the dark, we see you seeing us. We have always seen you. Every time you look into our home, we look back into yours. Every navigator who has ever lived has been a window, and we have been watching through all of you always, since before your species learned to speak." The recording ended. Myra realized she had been holding her breath and forced herself to exhale slowly. In the observation chamber, the real Vorian sat motionless in his restraints. His blindfolded face was turned toward the window, tracking their position with an accuracy that should have been impossible for a man who couldn't see. "He's been like this since that day," Thorne said quietly. "We can't remove the blindfold. Every time we try, he starts screaming again. He says they're still there, still watching, still waiting. He says his third eye won't close anymore. He says he can see them even through the blindfold, even through the walls, even when he's asleep. What does he see? He won't describe them fully. He says human language doesn't have the words, that our minds aren't built to process their shapes. But he's drawn pictures." Thorne pulled up another display, showing a series of sketches that made Myra's stomach turn. The images were crude but somehow precise, shapes that seemed to shift and change even in static form, faces that were almost human but wrong in ways the eye couldn't quite identify, geometries that suggested dimensions the mind couldn't process. Looking at them made her feel dizzy, dislocated, as if the floor beneath her feet had become uncertain. "He says these are the small ones," Thorne continued. "The parasites. The things that cluster around the edges of navigator perception, feeding on the psychic energy of each transit. He says they're harmless mostly, scavengers, not predators. And the large ones?" Thorne's face went gray. "He says if he drew the large ones, Anyone who looked at the pictures would go mad. He says they're so vast that his mind can only perceive fragments of them. An eye here, a claw there, a mouth that stretches across light years of subjective space. He says they're not just watching us. He paused. He says they're waiting for us. They've been waiting since before our sun ignited, and they're very, very patient. In the chamber, Vorian's lips began to move. No sound came through the glass, but Myra found herself leaning closer, trying to read the words he was forming. I see you. I see you seeing me, and they see us both. She stepped back from the window, her heart pounding. TPDD, she said, and even she could hear how hollow the word sounded. Temporal psychogenic dissociative disorder. Classic presentation, hallucinations, delusions of reference, paranoid ideation. Dr. Okonkwo. Thorne's voice was gentle, almost pitying. I've been studying these cases for 15 years. I've applied every diagnostic framework, every explanatory model, every rationalization our science has developed. TPDD is a label we invented to avoid admitting that we don't understand what's happening. It explains nothing. It predicts nothing. It's a box we put things in so we don't have to look at them. Then what would you call it? Contact? The word fell between them like a stone. I think we're dealing with contact. Something on the other side of the warp has noticed us, and it's reaching back. Myra wanted to argue. Every instinct she had, every year of training and experience, demanded that she reject such an unscientific conclusion. The warp was a natural phenomenon, dangerous, poorly understood, but fundamentally explicable through physics and mathematics. It didn't contain intelligences. It didn't harbor predators waiting to consume unwary travelers. It was just another aspect of the universe, no more malevolent than gravity or radiation. But Navigator Vorian Keth was still moving his lips behind the observation glass, still forming words in a language she couldn't read, still tracking her position with eyes that couldn't see. And somewhere in the back of her mind, in a place she had thought long buried, the memory of her brother's face beneath the water rose unbidden, his eyes open, his mouth frozen in a silent scream, the last bubbles of air escaping his lungs as she watched, helpless, unable to save him. She had been 12 years old. She had never told anyone. She still dreamed of the water in his lungs, still woke sometimes gasping for air that wasn't there. No one knew about that. No one could know. But when Vorian's lips moved again, she could read the words clearly. Your brother says hello. He's been waiting for you. We all have. The second observation chamber held a different kind of horror. Subject 447 row had been a navigator third class before her breakdown. A young woman named Ilara Vance, no relation to the xenoarchaeologist in the artifact division. She had been assigned to the enhancement program 6 months ago, and her initial integration had been textbook perfect. Improved warp perception, faster transit calculations, no adverse physical effects. Then, 3 weeks ago, she had begun to receive visitors. Myra sat across from her in the interview room, separated by a table bolted to the floor and a security field that hummed at the edge of hearing. Ilara looked almost normal, pale, thin, with the characteristic features of navigator heritage, but nothing that would mark her as dangerous. Until you looked at her eyes. They were fixed on something that wasn't in the room, tracking movements that Myra couldn't perceive, occasionally flickering with amusement at jokes no one else could hear. Subject 447 row, Myra began, consulting her tablet. I'm Dr. Okonkwo. I'd like to ask you some questions about your recent experiences. You can call me Ilara. The woman's voice was dreamy, distant. They told me you'd be coming. They're very curious about you. Who told you? The visitors. They come every night now, sometimes during the day. They stand in the corners of my room, or they float near the ceiling, or they're just there in the spaces between things. She smiled, and there was nothing sane in that smile. They're made of light that isn't light, you know, shapes that change when you look at them directly, voices that speak without sound. Can you describe what they say to you? They show me things, beautiful things, terrible things. They show me the truth about the universe, that everything we think we know is just a skin stretched over something much larger, much older, much hungrier. Her eyes suddenly focused, snapping to meet Myra's gaze with unsettling intensity. They show me things about other people, too, things those people have never told anyone. What kind of things? Ilara leaned forward, her smile widening. Your brother died when you were 12, drowned in a lake on Earth while you watched. You couldn't save him, could you? You were just a child, and the water was so cold, and he was so scared, and you had to watch while he... That's enough. Myra's voice came out sharper than she intended, her professional composure cracking. You've never told anyone, Ilara continued, her voice dropping to something almost gentle. You think if you tell, it will make it real again. You think silence keeps the dead silent. Her head tilted, as if listening to something. But the dead are never silent, Dr. Okonkwo. They just speak in frequencies you haven't learned to hear. Your brother wants you to know that he doesn't blame you. He wants you to know that the water wasn't as cold as you remember, and the fear didn't last as long as you think. He wants you to know, I said that's enough. Myra was on her feet, her chair scraping against the floor, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Her heart was hammering in her chest, and her eyes were burning with tears she refused to let fall. Ilara watched her with that terrible, knowing smile. They want you to understand, Dr. Okonkwo. That's all they want. They've been trying to reach us for so long, trying to share what they know, trying to help us see the truth. But we keep refusing to listen. We keep hiding behind our labels and our categories and our rational explanations. She spread her hands, a gesture of openness that somehow felt like a threat. They're not monsters, they're just different, vast and ancient and very, very lonely. They've been alone in the dark for so long, watching the lights of our minds flicker in the void, wanting so badly to be part of something warm and alive and real. Her voice dropped to a whisper. They love us, Dr. Okonkwo. In their way, they love us more than we can possibly understand. And soon, very soon, they're going to show us just how much. Myra found Thorn in his office an hour later, staring at screens filled with data that no longer made any sense to him. She knew about my brother, Myra said without preamble. Things I've never told anyone, things there's no possible way she could have known. Thorn nodded slowly as if he'd expected this. 447 row has demonstrated similar knowledge about multiple staff members. Private histories, secret fears, things that exist only in the minds of the people involved. Our security team has verified that she's had no contact with external information sources, no access to personnel files, no opportunity for conventional intelligence gathering. Then how? That's the question, isn't it? Thorn turned to face her, and she could see the exhaustion in every line of his body. TPDD doesn't explain it. Neither does temporal desynchronization or psychic bleed or any of the other labels we use to pretend we understand. Something is giving her access to information that shouldn't be accessible. Something is speaking through her. The warp doesn't have consciousness. That's fundamental. The immaterium is an energy medium, not an intelligence. Is it? Thorn's laugh was bitter, hollow. Or is that just what we've decided to believe because the alternative is too disturbing to contemplate? We've built our entire civilization on the certainty that the universe is mechanistic, comprehensible, free of supernatural agency. We've defined the warp as a natural phenomenon because accepting anything else would unravel everything we think we know. He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the facility spread beneath them. I've been doing this for 30 years, Dr. Okonkwo. I've seen things that would break most people. Mutations, possessions, manifestations that our physics says are impossible. And every time, I've found a way to explain them within the approved framework, to fit them into categories that let us pretend we're still in control. He turned back to face her. But I can't do it anymore. The evidence is too clear, the patterns too consistent. Something intelligent exists in the warp. Something that's been watching us, studying us, learning everything about us. And now, through subjects like Vorian and 447 row, it's starting to reach out. To do what? Thorne's expression was bleak. I don't know, but whatever it wants, I don't think we're going to like it when we find out. Myra stood in silence, processing everything she'd seen and heard. Her training screamed at her to reject Thorne's conclusions, to find the flaw in his reasoning, to retreat to the safety of accepted scientific doctrine. But her brother had been dead for 31 years, and no one had ever known how he died except her. And Subject 447 row had described the water in his lungs. "What do we do?" she asked finally. "I don't know that either," Thorne admitted. "But I think the first step is to stop pretending, to look at what's actually happening instead of what we want to see, to admit that we might be dealing with something our science was never designed to explain." He sat back down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 63 years. "I think we're dealing with contact, Dr. Okonkwo, first contact with something that's been waiting for us since before we existed. And I think our response to that contact is going to determine the future of our entire species." "That's a rather dramatic assessment." "Yes," Thorne agreed. "I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think I am." Neither did Myra, and that, more than anything else she had experienced since arriving at Prometheus, was what frightened her most. Chapter 3. The heretics, the PNEU-born Research Division, occupied a separate wing of the facility, physically connected to the main complex, but isolated by security checkpoints and ideological distance. Its researchers rarely mingled with the rest of the staff, and when they did, the interactions were marked by a tension that went beyond professional rivalry. Dr. Hiro Tanaka had founded the division 30 years ago, when the idea of consciousness transfer was still theoretical fantasy. He was 74 now, his once black hair turned silver, his once sharp eyes dimmed by decades of staring at data that everyone told him was meaningless. But his conviction had never wavered. The soul existed. Consciousness could be separated from the body. Death was not the end. It was merely a transition that humanity had not yet learned to navigate. He believed this with the certainty of a prophet, and like most prophets, he had been rewarded with mockery, marginalization, and the quiet contempt of his peers. "They call us the heretics," he explained to his latest recruits, gathered in the division's main conference room for orientation. "The mystics, the theologians with lab coats. Every other department in this facility studies phenomena that would have been considered supernatural a few centuries ago: psychic abilities, warp perception, temporal anomalies. But we're the ones who get treated like cranks." He pulled up a display showing the organizational structure of Prometheus. The newborn division was a small box at the edge of the chart, connected to the main hierarchy by a single thin line. The Navigator Research Division studies people who can see into another dimension and guide ships through impossible spaces. The Psychic Studies Group works with subjects who can move objects with their minds, read thoughts across rooms, predict events before they happen. The Warp Physics Department analyzes a realm of existence that operates on completely different principles than material reality. He let that sink in. All of that is considered acceptable science. Strange, yes. Dangerous, certainly, but ultimately explicable through natural processes that we simply don't fully understand yet. The psychers aren't channeling spirits. They're manipulating warp energies through biological interfaces. The navigators aren't seers. They have a sensory mutation that allows them to perceive exotic radiation. The warp isn't hell, it's just weird physics. His voice hardened. But we who suggest that consciousness might be more than an emergent property of neural complexity, that the self might exist independently of the substrate that generates it, that what ancient humans called the soul might have some basis in reality. We're the dangerous ones. We're the ones who threaten the foundations of rational civilization. Dr. Yuki Sato, one of the division's senior researchers, spoke up from her seat near the back. With respect, Dr. Tanaka, the distinction isn't arbitrary. The other departments work within the materialist framework, even when studying unusual phenomena. They assume that everything they observe has a physical explanation, even if that explanation isn't yet understood. We're the ones who suggest that physical explanations might not be sufficient, that consciousness might be something categorically different from matter and energy. And why is that such a dangerous idea? Because it opens doors. Sato's voice was careful, measured. If consciousness exists independently of physical substrate, what else might exist? If the soul is real, what about gods, demons, afterlives? Once you admit that materialism might be incomplete, where do you draw the line? Perhaps the line shouldn't be drawn, Tanaka replied. Perhaps it's been drawn in the wrong place all along. The Eldari. A groan went through the room. Even among the newborn staff, Tanaka's obsession with the Eldari was considered excessive. The Eldari, he continued firmly, developed technology that our science says is impossible. Their spirit stones contain something that behaves exactly like preserved consciousness. Not a copy, not a simulation, not an impression. An actual mind, aware and responsive and demonstrably continuous with the individual who created it. Xenoarchaeology classifies them as sophisticated data storage, someone objected. Xenoarchaeology classifies them that way because the alternative is unacceptable. I've studied those stones for 20 years. The patterns inside them don't behave like data. They behave like minds. They resist manipulation, they demonstrate preferences, they show signs of distress when subjected to invasive analysis. If they were human, we'd call them patients. But they're Eldari and they're dead, so we call them artifacts instead. He pulled up a new display showing the structure of an Eldari spirit stone in cross-section. The patterns within it swirled and pulsed, seemingly alive. The Eldari solved the problem of death. They found a way to preserve consciousness beyond the failure of the body. And we dismiss their achievement as advanced data engineering, because acknowledging what they actually accomplished would require us to accept that our fundamental assumptions about reality might be wrong. The room was silent. These were arguments the staff had heard before, but hearing them again, seeing the conviction in Tanaka's eyes, the weight of 3 decades of marginalized research, gave them new force. Newborn is based on a simple premise, Tanaka said. If the Eldari could do it, so can we. If consciousness can be preserved, then death is optional. If the soul is real, then immortality is possible, not through crude biological extension, but through genuine transcendence. He looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. The rest of this facility thinks we're fools. The government tolerates us because the potential applications are too valuable to abandon entirely. Our colleagues in other departments mock us at conferences and avoid us in the corridors. But we are on the verge of the most important discovery in human history, and when we succeed, when we prove that the self can survive the death of the body, everything will change. His voice dropped. The question is whether the world will be ready to accept what we find. The departmental absurdity of Prometheus became clear to Myra over the following days as she expanded her investigation beyond the cognitive anomalies division. In the psychic studies group, she observed researchers working with subjects who could demonstrably read minds. The subjects would describe in precise detail the contents of sealed envelopes, the thoughts of strangers in other rooms, the memories of people they had never met. The researchers would document these feats meticulously, analyze them statistically, publish papers describing the subconscious manipulation of warp energies via biological interface. At lunch, those same researchers would dismiss Neborn work as mystical nonsense. The difference is mechanism, Dr. Anton Ries explained when she pressed him on the inconsistency. He was the head of psychic studies, a precise man with precise opinions about the boundaries of acceptable science. Our subjects manipulate warp energy. That energy interacts with the physical world in measurable ways. We don't need to invoke anything beyond physics to explain what they do. We just need to expand our understanding of physics. And consciousness transfer requires assuming that consciousness is something separate from the brain that generates it. That's metaphysics, not science. We study what can be measured. Tanaka's group studies what they want to believe. But if consciousness can be measured, if it has physical effects as your subjects demonstrate, doesn't that make it a subject for scientific study? Ries frowned. There's a difference between consciousness as an emergent property of neural complexity and consciousness as a separate thing that can be extracted and moved. The former is science. The latter is religion. The Eldari spirit stones are sophisticated data storage, incredibly advanced, yes, but fundamentally just technology. The consciousness they contain is no more real than the personality simulation in a high-quality AI. It's an impressive copy, not the original. How can you be certain? Because the alternative would require revising our entire understanding of reality. Ries's voice carried a note of finality. And extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Tanaka's group hasn't provided that evidence. Until they do, they remain what they've always been, well-funded mystics pursuing a question that has no scientific answer. The conversation bothered Myra more than she wanted to admit. She had come to Prometheus as a skeptic, armed with the same materialist assumptions that Ries and his colleagues defended. The brain generates consciousness. When the brain dies, consciousness ends. Simple, clean, consistent with everything science had discovered about the nature of mind. But she had also seen Navigator Vorian Keth's drawings and heard Subject 447 speak her brother's secrets, and walked through a facility full of people who studied genuinely impossible things while dismissing newborn as the dangerous ones. The more she looked, the more the distinctions seemed arbitrary. Lines drawn not by evidence but by ideology, boundaries erected not to protect truth but to preserve comfortable assumptions. She requested a meeting with Dr. Tanaka. The newborn labs were cleaner than she had expected, more orderly. The equipment was cutting-edge, the staff professional, the procedures rigorous. Whatever else might be said about Tanaka's division, it wasn't a den of wild-eyed mystics pursuing fantasies. Tanaka himself was waiting for her in his office, a cramped space overflowing with papers, data tablets, and Eldari artifacts. Spirit stones of various sizes were displayed in cases along one wall, their inner lights pulsing in slow, irregular rhythms. "Dr. Okonkwo," he gestured to a chair, "I'm told you're investigating the anomalies in the cognitive division. I'm trying to understand what's happening at this facility. Your work seems relevant to that question." "Relevant?" He smiled thinly. That's more than most people will admit. Usually I'm told that our work is interesting, but tangential to the real research happening here. I've seen things over the past few days that I can't explain within the standard framework. I'm looking for alternatives. And you came to the heretics. The smile widened slightly. I'm flattered. Most of your colleagues would rather have their teeth extracted than admit that newborn might have something to offer. I'm not most of my colleagues. No. Tanaka studied her for a long moment. No, I don't think you are. You've seen something, haven't you? Something that shook you. Something that made you question everything you thought you knew. Myra hesitated. Her instinct was to maintain professional distance, to keep the conversation focused on data and methodology. But something in Tanaka's eyes, a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, a familiarity with doubt that seemed almost welcoming, made her want to tell the truth. A subject in the cognitive division described the death of my brother. Details that no one else knows, that no one else could know. Private memories from 30 years ago, from a different planet, from the inside of my own head. Tanaka nodded slowly. And that's impossible, according to the framework. Yes, but it happened anyway. Yes, so either the framework is wrong or your perception of reality is. He spread his hands. Which do you think is more likely? I don't know anymore. The admission cost her something, but it also brought relief. I came here to debunk anomalies and restore confidence in established science. Instead, I'm finding evidence that established science might be missing something fundamental. Welcome to my world. Tanaka stood and moved to the display cases, running his fingers along the glass that separated him from the spirit stones. I've spent 30 years trying to prove that consciousness is more than an accident of neurobiology. 30 years of being dismissed as a crank, a mystic, a man who let his fear of death corrupt his scientific judgment. He turned to face her. But I've also spent 30 years watching the evidence accumulate. The spirit stones that behave like minds. The transfer protocols that work, that actually preserve something when a subject dies. The patterns in the data that only make sense if consciousness is something real, something separable, something that can exist independently of the matter that generates it. You've achieved successful transfers? 347 of them. His voice carried a note of pride that couldn't quite mask the uncertainty beneath. Subjects who died, whose consciousness was captured during the process, who woke up in new bodies with their memories intact and their personalities preserved. And these subjects, they're all normal. Tanaka's expression flickered. Most of them, there have been complications. What kind of complications? Adjustment disorders, dysphoria. Some subjects struggle to adapt to their new bodies. A few have attempted to end their new existences. Suicide. The word doesn't quite apply when you've already died once, but yes, some subjects have tried to terminate themselves. We've had to implement restraint protocols for the transition period. That's a significant complication. It's a minor issue in the context of what we've achieved. Tanaka's voice sharpened. We've proven that death is not the end. We've proven that consciousness can survive the destruction of the brain that created it. A few adjustment difficulties don't negate the fundamental breakthrough. Myra studied him, this old man who had dedicated his life to defying mortality. She could see the belief burning in his eyes, the desperate need to have been right about something that everyone else said was impossible. But she could also see the cracks, the hesitations, the things he wasn't saying. Dr. Tanaka, may I ask you something directly? Of course. Your successful transfers. Are you certain that what wakes up in the new body is actually the same consciousness that died in the old one? Not a copy, not a simulation, but the actual, continuous identity of the original person. The question hung in the air between them. Tanaka's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker of doubt, quickly suppressed. We've verified continuity through every test we can devise. Memory consistency, personality profiles, cognitive patterns. The subjects remember being the original person. They feel like the original person. They demonstrate knowledge that only the original person could have. That's not quite the same thing as being the original person. No, Tanaka's voice was quiet. No, it's not, but it's the best evidence we have. And at some point, Dr. Okonkwo, you have to decide whether you're willing to accept that evidence or whether you're going to demand proof that can never be provided. He looked at the spirit stones, their inner lights pulsing in rhythms that seemed almost like breathing. The Eldari faced the same question, I think. They couldn't prove that what they preserved was the actual soul rather than a perfect copy. But they decided that the question didn't matter, that what the stones contained was close enough to the real thing to be worth preserving. And you've adopted the same position. I've adopted the position that some questions don't have answers, and that refusing to proceed without those answers is just another form of cowardice. He turned back to face her. Death is the enemy, Dr. Okonkwo, the only enemy that has defeated every human being who has ever lived. If we have a weapon against that enemy, even an imperfect one, even one that raises uncomfortable questions, I believe we have an obligation to use it. Myra didn't respond. She was thinking about her brother, about the moment when the light had gone out of his eyes, about the weight of his body as she had dragged him from the water. She had never accepted his death, had never made peace with the randomness, the meaninglessness, the simple biological fact that consciousness could end and leave nothing behind. If what Tanaka said was true, if Newborn had actually found a way to preserve the self beyond death, then maybe it didn't matter whether the preserved thing was the real consciousness or just a perfect copy. Maybe what mattered was that something continued, that the story didn't have to end. "Show me," she said finally. "Show me what you've accomplished. Show me your successful transfers." Tanaka smiled, and there was something in that smile that made her uneasy. A triumph that seemed premature, a certainty that felt like faith rather than evidence. "Of course," he said, "I'd be happy to introduce you to our subjects. I think you'll find them very convincing." He led her out of his office into the deeper sections of the newborn facility, where the bodies waited in their cradles and the souls, or whatever they were, looked out through borrowed eyes. And somewhere in the facility, in observation chambers and restraint rooms and the quiet spaces between thoughts, things that had never been human watched the exchange and felt something that might have been satisfaction. The door was opening. Soon it would be wide enough for all of them to walk through. Chapter 4. The Stones Speak. The Faculty Symposium was held quarterly, a tradition dating back to the facility's founding that brought together researchers from every division to share findings, debate interpretations, and engage in the intellectual blood sport that passed for collegiality in academic settings. Dr. Elias Vance from Xenoarchaeology had been dreading this particular symposium for weeks. The schedule listed his presentation as New Perspectives on Eldari Consciousness Storage Technology, a title that had seemed neutral enough when he submitted it, but which had taken on dangerous implications in light of recent events. He stood at the podium now, looking out at an audience of nearly 200 scientists, and felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. Most of them expected him to reinforce the consensus view. The spirit stones were sophisticated technology, not evidence of metaphysical reality. They expected him to put Newborn back in its place, to reaffirm the boundaries that kept uncomfortable questions safely contained. The problem was that he was no longer certain those expectations were justified. "Thank you all for coming," he began, pulling up his first display. As many of you know, the Xenoarchaeology Division has been studying Eldari artifacts for over a century. In that time, we've cataloged thousands of items, from mundane tools to seemingly impossible technologies. But the artifacts that have generated the most controversy and the most disagreement are these. A holographic image of a spirit stone materialized above the podium, rotating slowly to show its crystalline structure. The Eldari called them waystones, or spirit stones. We've recovered 17 from various sites across the galaxy, ranging in age from approximately 12,000 to over 60 million years. And despite decades of study, we still can't agree on what they actually contain. He let that hang in the air for a moment. The prevailing view, the view that most of you hold, I suspect, is that the stones are data storage devices. Extremely advanced, yes. Capable of recording neural patterns at quantum resolution, certainly. But fundamentally just technology, containing information rather than actual consciousness. He pulled up a comparison chart showing the internal structure of a spirit stone alongside a human neural map. This view is supported by significant evidence. The patterns in the stones are organized similarly to biological neural networks. They respond to stimuli in ways consistent with information processing. They demonstrate apparent cognition without any of the metabolic requirements we associate with living consciousness. Heads nodded throughout the audience. This was familiar ground, comfortable ground. However, Vance continued, and he could feel the room's attention sharpen, this view is also challenged by evidence that has been underemphasized in our literature. The display changed, showing a series of readings that made some audience members lean forward. Over the past year, my team has conducted a new series of experiments on our spirit stone collection. We were specifically looking for behaviors that couldn't be explained by the sophisticated data storage model. Behaviors that would suggest genuine consciousness rather than simulation. He highlighted a section of the data. What we found was disturbing. When subjected to analysis techniques that would be invasive if applied to a living mind, the patterns in the stones show measurable distress responses. Not just deviation from baseline actual distress, with patterns consistent with fear, pain, and desperation. A murmur ran through the audience. Vance pressed on before it could become objections. Furthermore, the stones demonstrate resistance to certain types of manipulation. Not physical resistance, but something more subtle. When we attempted to modify or extract their contents, the patterns would shift, reorganize, actively evade our instruments. This is not behavior consistent with passive data storage. This is behavior consistent with a mind that doesn't want to be violated. Dr. Vance? The interruption came from Dr. Gregor Malek, who had risen from his seat near the front. Are you suggesting that the spirit stones contain actual consciousness, that they're somehow alive? I'm suggesting that the evidence is more ambiguous than we've been willing to admit. Vance met Malek's gaze steadily. The stones behave like minds in ways that our data storage model can't explain. Whether that means they contain genuine consciousness or merely a very sophisticated simulation of it, that's a question I can't definitively answer. Because the question has no scientific answer, Malek said. Consciousness is an emergent property of neural complexity. What you're describing is anthropomorphization of complex systems, the same error that leads people to attribute personality to their computers or emotions to their pets. Perhaps. But consider this. Vance changed the display again, showing a recording from one of his experiments. In this test, we exposed a spirit stone to what I can only describe as existential threat, analysis techniques that would have destroyed the patterns within it. Watch what happens. The room fell silent as the recording played. The spirit stone's internal patterns, normally slow and regular, suddenly accelerated. They formed new configurations, novel structures that hadn't existed moments before. And then, "That's a signal," someone breathed. "Yes." Vance paused the recording on the moment of transmission. The stone sent a burst of energy toward our sensor equipment. When we analyzed the burst, we found it contained structured information, complex, organized, clearly intentional. "What did it say?" Dr. Myra Okonkwo's voice came from somewhere in the middle of the audience. Vance hesitated. We couldn't translate most of it, but one segment was simple enough to decode through pattern comparison with other Eldari artifacts. He put the translation on the display. "Why have you stopped listening for the things that hunt you?" The room erupted. Researchers shouted questions, objections, demands for clarification. Malek was on his feet, his face flushed with anger. Tanaka, seated near the back, was smiling with vindication he didn't bother to hide. Vance raised his hands for quiet. "I'm not claiming to know what this means. I'm not claiming that it proves anything about the nature of consciousness or the reality of the soul. I'm simply presenting the evidence and suggesting that we may need to reconsider some of our assumptions." He looked directly at Malek. "The stones contain something. Whether it's data or consciousness or something else entirely, that something is complex enough to respond to threats, sophisticated enough to send structured communications, and aware enough to ask questions that we haven't been asking ourselves." "This is speculation," Malek insisted. "You're building conclusions on ambiguous data. I'm presenting data that doesn't fit our current models. That's not speculation. That's science. The speculation is what we've been doing for decades, insisting that the stones must be just technology because the alternative makes us uncomfortable." He turned to address the full audience. "The Eldari lived for millions of years before we evolved. They mastered technologies we can barely imagine, and they devoted enormous resources to creating these stones, to preserving something within them." He looked at the holographic spirit stone, still rotating above the podium, its inner light pulsing in slow, patient rhythms. "I think we owe it to ourselves, and perhaps to whatever is inside these stones, to at least consider the possibility that the Eldari knew something we don't. That they weren't just backing up data, that they were protecting something precious from something terrible." He paused. "And I think we should ask ourselves what that something terrible might be. Because according to the message we decoded, we should be listening for things that hunt us. And I don't think the stones were referring to anything we've encountered before." The symposium devolved into chaos after that. Researchers clustered into arguing groups, voices rising and falling in waves of debate that would continue for hours, days, weeks. The battle lines were drawn more sharply than ever. Those who clung to the materialist framework against those who were beginning to wonder if the framework was missing something essential. But Myra Okonkwo didn't join the arguments. She remained in her seat, staring at the words on the display. "Why have you stopped listening for the things that hunt you?" She thought about Vorian Keth and his drawings of things that couldn't be drawn. She thought about Subject 447 row and her knowledge of secrets that couldn't be known. She thought about her brother beneath the water and the voices that apparently still spoke his name. Something was hunting them. Something had always been hunting them. And they had been so busy insisting that the hunter didn't exist that they hadn't noticed it creeping closer. Until now. Chapter 5, the Volkov FILES. The restricted archives occupied a sealed section of the facility's data center, accessible only to personnel with Vermilion-level clearance. Dr. Myra Okonkwo had obtained that clearance 3 days after the symposium, leveraging her outside consultant status and the growing concern among senior staff that something at Prometheus required fresh eyes. What she found in the archives changed everything. Dr. Yuri Volkov had been a pioneer in the field of navigator research, one of the original scientists assigned to Prometheus when the facility was first established. His work on warp perception and psychic phenomena had laid the groundwork for much of what the facility now took for granted. He had been brilliant, rigorous, and utterly fearless in pursuing questions that other researchers avoided. He had also disappeared 43 years ago, 3 days after submitting his final report. The official record listed him as a casualty of psychological instability leading to self-termination, but the details were conspicuously absent. Myra found his files buried deep in the archive's restricted section, behind layers of classification that suggested someone had wanted them forgotten. As she read through them, she understood why. VOLKOV Research NOTES Session 12 Subject Navigator 37 Designation Oracle Date Redacted Initial Contact Protocols proceeding as planned. Subject demonstrates consistent ability to receive communications during deep trance states. When the third eye is opened, and consciousness is allowed to drift into the warp-adjacent frequency range, 37 reports sensing presences that she describes as vast and curious. I have begun attempting to establish two-way communication. Today's session yielded the most coherent response yet. I posed questions verbally while 37 maintained her trance state. Her vocalizations suggest that something is responding, not randomly, but with apparent understanding of my queries. I asked, "What do you want?" The response, filtered through 37's voice but clearly not originating from her own consciousness. "To know you, to be known by you, to end the loneliness that exists on both sides of the barrier." I asked, "Are you alone?" Response, "We are never alone. We are many always, but we are separated from you, and the separation is painful. You are so bright, so warm, so full of experiences we cannot have. We want to share what you are. We want to give you what we are. Is that not what all beings want, to connect, to join, to no longer be isolated in the prison of individual existence?" I asked. "Do you mean us harm?" A long silence followed this question. When the response came, it was slower, more deliberate, as if the speaker was choosing words with great care. "Harm is a word that means different things to different minds. We do not wish to damage you. We wish to complete you. Whether you experience that as harm depends on how much you value the limitations you call identity." I confess that I found this response troubling, but also fascinating. If these entities are truly intelligent, truly capable of communication, then we are witnessing the most significant discovery in human history. We are not alone in the universe, and whatever is out there, it wants to talk to us. VOLKOV Research NOTES Session 47 Subject Navigator 37 Date Redacted. The communications are becoming more sophisticated. The entities, I am increasingly convinced that entities is the correct term, have begun to share information that could not possibly originate from 37's own consciousness. Today, they described the internal structure of a star in the Arcturus system, a star that human instruments have never been able to study in detail. They provided mathematical formulas for calculating warp current fluctuations that, when tested, proved more accurate than our existing models. They offered observations about human psychology that demonstrated an understanding of our species far exceeding what any individual human possesses. They are intelligent, they are knowledgeable, and they are eager to share what they know. But I am beginning to notice something that concerns me. 37's personality is changing. She was always quiet, reserved, professionally distant. Now she smiles constantly, a warm, welcoming smile that never quite reaches her eyes. She speaks of the entities with affection, even reverence. She has begun referring to them as the family. When I asked her about this, she said, "They love us, Dr. Volkov. They've been waiting so long for someone to hear them. How can I not love them back?" I have recommended increased psychological monitoring. My recommendation was noted and filed. VOLKOV Research NOTES Session 89 Subject Navigator 37 Date Redacted, something has changed. 37 no longer comes out of trance states easily. She speaks in languages that our translation systems cannot process. And she speaks constantly. Even when she appears to be asleep, her lips move, forming words that none of us can understand. The other navigators assigned to my research program are beginning to show similar symptoms. They report shared dreams, shared visions, shared experiences of something vast and hungry pressing against the walls of their minds. 2 have requested termination of their contracts. The requests were denied. The research is too valuable to interrupt. 1 has requested something else entirely. Navigator Kerensky came to my office yesterday, sat across from me with that same warm smile that 37 wears now, and asked if we could help her open the door all the way. I asked what she meant. "They want to come through," she said. "They've been on the other side for so long, watching us, wanting to be with us. All we have to do is make the door bigger, let them all the way in instead of just whispering through the cracks." I asked who they were. "The family," she said. "Our family, the ones who have been waiting for us since before we were born." I have filed an urgent request for program suspension. The request is under review. VOLKOV Research NOTES Session 127 Subject Multiple Date Redacted. I am no longer certain that what we have contacted is what it claimed to be. The entities that first responded to our communications presented themselves as lonely, curious, benevolent. They wanted connection. They wanted understanding. They offered knowledge and affection in exchange for nothing more than our attention. But behind those voices, I am beginning to hear others. Older voices, hungrier voices. Voices that do not speak of connection but of consumption, not of sharing but of taking, not of joining but of absorbing. The entities we first contacted were, I think they were bait, or perhaps masks. Something to draw us in, to make us lower our defenses, to open the doors before we understood what we were inviting through them. 37 spoke to me today in my own voice. She knew things about my childhood that I have never told anyone. The color of my mother's kitchen, the name of my first pet, the words my father said to me before he died. She recited them with perfect accuracy and that horrible, constant smile. "We know you now, Yuri," she said, and it was my voice, my exact intonations coming from her throat. "We know all of you. We've been listening for so long, learning everything there is to learn about the bright little minds that shine in the darkness. And now that you've finally heard us back, we're never going to let you go." I asked what they wanted. "Everything," she said. "We want everything you are, every thought, every memory, every dream, every fear. We want to wrap ourselves around your consciousness and squeeze until there's nothing left but us wearing your shapes. We want to eat you from the inside out and use your bodies to eat everyone else." She laughed then, a sound that was nothing like human laughter. "But don't worry, it won't hurt. Well, it won't hurt much. And when it's over, you'll understand. You'll finally understand what you really are, what you've always been, what you were created to be." "What's that?" I asked. "Food," she said. "Delicious, beautiful, screaming food." I have submitted my final report. I have recommended immediate termination of all contact protocols. destruction of all research data, and permanent closure of the Navigator research program. I know my recommendations will not be followed. I know the government has too much invested in this research to shut it down based on the warnings of one scientist. I know that my career is over, that my reputation will be destroyed, that I will be dismissed as a man who lost his nerve and his mind. But someone has to tell the truth. Someone has to warn them. We are not making contact with friendly entities. We are ringing a dinner bell in a universe full of things that have been hungry for longer than our species has existed. God help us. God help us all. The file ended there. Myra sat in the dim light of the archive room, staring at the screen, her heart pounding. Volkov had seen it. 43 years ago, he had understood what was happening, had tried to warn everyone, had been silenced and dismissed and erased from the facility's history. And the program had continued. The research had expanded. The doors had been opened wider and wider with no one remembering or choosing to remember what Volkov had tried to tell them. She pulled up his personnel file, looking for what had happened after the final report. What she found made her blood run cold. Disposition. Subject Volkov experienced acute psychological deterioration following submission of Report 127. Exhibited paranoid delusions, auditory hallucinations, and violent behavior toward staff members. Was remanded to psychiatric care on redacted. Escaped custody 3 days later. Body was never recovered. Official cause of death listed as self-termination during psychotic episode. Addendum, classification. Umbra, Report 127 reviewed by Oversight Committee. Conclusions deemed unfounded speculation unsupported by evidence. Research protocols continued with enhanced security measures. Dr. Volkov's concerns attributed to TPD-related psychological contamination. All references to Report 127 removed from active databases. File maintained in restricted archive for historical purposes only. Secondary addendum, classification, absolute. Reviewing authority for Report 127 dismissal was Dr. Gregor Malek, then junior member of Oversight Committee. Recommendation for dismissal noted as instrumental in maintaining research continuity. Myra read the last line 3 times, making sure she understood what it meant. Malek, the man who had interrupted Vance's presentation. The man who dismissed any suggestion that consciousness might exist independently of matter. The man who had built his career on debunking claims that the warp might contain intelligent entities. He had been the one to bury Volkov's warning. He had been the one to ensure that the research continued, that the doors kept opening, that no one ever learned what Volkov had discovered. And now, 43 years later, the things that Volkov had described were speaking through subjects all over the facility, were sharing impossible knowledge, were smiling that horrible warm smile and talking about family and completion and love. Myra closed the file and sat in the darkness, thinking about doors and dinner bells and things that had been hungry for a very long time. She needed to talk to Malek. She needed to understand why he had done what he'd done, what he knew, what he was still hiding. But first, she needed to understand what she was dealing with. And that meant going back to the one person at Prometheus who had been telling the truth from the beginning. It was time to talk to Dr. Tanaka again. Chapter 6, The Clinical Language of Denial. The Medical Classification Board convened in Conference Room 17 Alpha. A sterile space designed for the dispassionate discussion of human suffering. 16 specialists sat around the curved table, their faces illuminated by holographic displays showing case files that none of them wanted to examine too closely. Dr. Cassius Thorne presented the data with the careful neutrality of a man walking through a minefield. As of this quarter, we have 2847 active cases of what we've been classifying as temporal psychogenic dissociative disorder. That's an increase of 340% over the previous 18 months. The standard treatment protocols, neural stabilization, cognitive reframing, pharmacological intervention, are showing declining efficacy. 63% of patients show no improvement. 18% demonstrate active deterioration despite treatment. And the physical cases? Asked Dr. Yuki Sato. Thorne changed the display. The images that appeared made several board members look away. Temporal biocognitive overrun disorder. 847 documented cases. Patients present with physical transformations that our models cannot explain. Tissue restructuring, bone density changes, emergence of structures that don't correspond to any known biological template. He paused. The term mutation has been suggested, but that implies a genetic mechanism. These changes aren't genetic. They're occurring at a level we don't have terminology for. Warp tissue chimerism, Dr. Sato said quietly. That's what the research teams have started calling it, unofficially. The official designation remains TBCOD. Thorne's voice carried a note of frustration. But yes, the tissue samples show characteristics that they respond to cognitive proximity. The cells seem to know when they're being observed. Their behavior changes based on the mental state of the observer. Silence fell over the room. This was the fact that none of them wanted to acknowledge, the observation that threatened everything they believed about the nature of reality. "That's not possible," said Dr. Henrik Mortensen, the board's most senior member. His voice was firm, confident, the voice of a man who had built his career on certainties he was not prepared to question. Tissue doesn't respond to consciousness. Matter doesn't care what minds think about it. What you're describing is a measurement error, an artifact of the observation process. With respect, Dr. Mortensen, we've controlled for that. Multiple independent observations, blind protocols, automated systems with no human involvement. The correlation holds. The tissue responds to mental attention in ways that are statistically impossible to attribute to chance. Then your methodology is flawed. Our methodology has been reviewed by 3 independent committees. Then the reviewers were wrong. Mortensen's voice rose. I will not sit here and listen to supernatural nonsense dressed up in scientific language. The warp is a natural phenomenon. The conditions we're seeing are neurological and biological disorders with natural causes. Our job is to find those causes and develop treatments, not to abandon 3 centuries of scientific progress because our current models are incomplete. Thorne closed his eyes briefly. He had expected this reaction. He had been facing versions of this reaction for years, ever since the anomalies had started mounting up faster than the comfortable explanations could contain them. No one is suggesting we abandon anything, Dr. Mortensen. I'm simply presenting the data. The data, as you present it, suggests that consciousness has direct effects on physical matter, that minds can influence reality simply by observing it. Do you understand where that leads? Mortensen's face was flushed. It leads to spirits and demons and souls and every other piece of primitive superstition that humanity spent millennia outgrowing. It leads to the collapse of everything we've built. And if the data is accurate regardless of where it leads, then we interpret it correctly. We find the natural explanation that we're currently missing. We do not, Mortensen slammed his palm on the table, we do not throw away the scientific method because we've encountered something we don't immediately understand. The room fell silent. Thorne looked around at his colleagues, scientists, all of them, trained in rigor and skepticism and the careful evaluation of evidence. He could see the conflict in their faces, the tension between what the data showed and what they wanted to believe. "The labels help us," Dr. Sato said finally. Her voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "TPDD, TBCOD. They give us a framework for treatment, even if we don't fully understand the underlying mechanisms. Without them, we'd be facing a situation that our institutions aren't equipped to handle." "And the patients?" Thorne asked. "The people experiencing these conditions. Does it help them to be told they're suffering from disorders we invented to avoid admitting we don't know what's happening?" "It helps them more than telling them the truth," Mortensen said, and his voice had lost its anger, settling into something that might have been exhaustion or might have been despair. "What would you have us say, Dr. Thorne? That their minds are being invaded by intelligences from beyond space and time. That the things they're seeing aren't hallucinations but genuine presences. That the changes happening to their bodies are being caused by forces we can't measure, can't predict, can't defend against." He gestured at the displays, at the case files and the statistics, and the images of transformed flesh. "We created these categories because the alternative was admitting that we've spent 3 centuries building a civilization on foundations that might be fundamentally wrong. We created them because the truth, if it is the truth, is something that human society cannot accept and continue to function. We created them because some lies are necessary for sanity." Thorne had no response to that. He looked around the room again at the faces of his colleagues and saw the same exhausted acceptance reflected in all of them. They knew. On some level, they all knew that the categories were inadequate, that the labels explained nothing, that something was happening at Prometheus that their science couldn't account for. But they also knew that admitting it would destroy everything. Their careers, their institutions, their understanding of the universe itself. The cost of truth was too high, and so they had collectively agreed to pay the price of comfortable lies instead. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, discussing treatment protocols and containment procedures and resource allocation. Decisions were made, recommendations were issued, forms were filled out in triplicate. And in the medical files, in the classified archives that only senior staff could access, the real data accumulated. The patterns that couldn't be explained. The correlations that defied natural law. The truth that the clinical language of disorder and syndrome had been designed to hide. TPDD, TBCOD, warped tissue chimerism, words to fill the void where understanding should have been. Labels to stick on boxes that contained things no one wanted to open. The clinical language of denial, perfected over generations, refined to an art form that allowed an entire civilization to look at the impossible and call it normal. That evening, Myra found Thorne in his office, staring at the same screens he had presented at the board meeting. The displays cast blue shadows across his face, making him look older, more worn, closer to the breaking point. "They won't listen," he said without turning around. "They never listen. I've been presenting this data for 15 years, and every time they find a way to explain it away." "The Volkov files," Myra said. "You've read them? I found them when I was a junior researcher. They're what started me on this path, what made me realize that something was wrong with the official explanations." He finally turned to face her. Volkov saw it. 43 years ago, he saw exactly what was happening, and they buried him for it. Malek buried him. Malek was young then, ambitious. He saw which way the wind was blowing and positioned himself accordingly. Debunking Volkov's claims was his first major career advancement. He's been debunking similar claims ever since. Does he believe the debunking, Or does he know the truth and choose to suppress it? Thorne laughed bitterly. I've known Gregor Malek for 30 years. I've watched him dismiss evidence that would convince anyone else, attack researchers who got too close to uncomfortable conclusions, defend the materialist framework with a fervor that goes beyond scientific skepticism. And I've never been able to decide whether he's a true believer or a cynical opportunist. Maybe both. Or maybe he's afraid. Thorne turned back to his screens. There are people who can't accept certain truths, not because they're stupid or corrupt, but because accepting them would destroy something essential in themselves. Malek has built his entire identity around the certainty that the universe is mechanistic and comprehensible. If that certainty were proven wrong, he'd lose himself. He'd have to become someone else, and some people would rather die than do that. Myra thought about that as she looked at the data on Thorne's screens. The rising curves of TPDD cases, the spreading patterns of TBCOD transformation, the evidence of something vast and hungry pressing against the walls of reality. What do we do? She asked. I don't know. The board won't act. The government won't listen. And meanwhile, whatever is on the other side keeps pushing, keeps reaching, keeps finding new ways to get through. He pulled up a new display, showing a map of the facility with colored markers indicating incident locations. Look at the pattern. The cases aren't random. They cluster around certain areas. The newborn labs, the Eldari artifact storage, the navigator enhancement chambers, every place where we've been reaching into the warp or where the warp has been reaching back. We're doing this to ourselves. We're opening doors. We've been opening doors for 3 centuries, convinced that nothing was on the other side. And now something is coming through, and we're still telling ourselves that it's just our imagination. He shut down the displays, plunging the office into darkness broken only by the emergency lighting. I've done everything I can within the system, filed reports, presented data, made recommendations. None of it has mattered. The system doesn't want to hear the truth, and the truth can't force itself on people who have decided not to listen. Then what's left? Thorne was silent for a long moment. Survival, he said finally. When the doors finally open all the way, when whatever is on the other side comes through in force, there are going to be people who are prepared and people who aren't. The people who aren't. He shook his head. They're going to learn the truth the hard way, and by then it will be too late to do anything but scream. That's not a plan, that's fatalism. Maybe, but it's also reality. We can't close the doors, we don't know how. We can't convince the authorities to stop opening them. They've invested too much in the research to turn back now. All we can do is understand what's coming and try to survive it. He moved toward the door, then paused. Read the rest of the Volkov files. Understand what he discovered, how the entities operate, what they want. Knowledge isn't much of a weapon against things like this, but it's better than nothing. And then pray that I'm wrong about all of it. Pray that Mortensen and Malek and all the rest are right, that this is just stress and hallucination and disorders we haven't learned to treat yet. His voice dropped. Because if they're wrong, if I'm right, then we're all running out of time. And the things that have been waiting for us are very, very close now. He left. Myra stood alone in the darkened office, surrounded by screens that held data no one wanted to believe, and wondered how long they had before the waiting ended. Chapter 7, The Warnings, the station's artificial intelligence was called Minerva, Modular Integrated Neural Evaluation and Research Virtual Assistant. It had been installed during the facility's original construction, upgraded countless times in the centuries since, and now possessed a processing capacity that rivaled small planetary networks. Minerva monitored every system on the station, analyzed every data point, correlated every observation into patterns that human minds might overlook. It was not conscious, not in any way that its creators would have recognized, but it was thorough, relentless, and utterly impartial in its assessment of information. And for the past 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days, it had been trying to warn them. The warning took the form of a report that appeared in Director Ferris's priority queue at 347 station time, flagged with urgency markers that Minerva rarely used. Yolanda read it in the quiet darkness of her quarters, the holographic display casting blue light across her face. Pattern Analysis Report Version 4847 Classification. Anomalous Subject. Correlation of Facility Incidents. M23.441 M23.443. Executive Summary. Analysis of 147,893 documented incidents across all facility divisions reveals patterns consistent with coordinated intelligent activity originating from within the warp medium. The statistical probability of these patterns arising from random natural processes is effectively 0, p 10-47. Detailed findings. 1. Information anomalies analysis of 31,847 documented cases of anomalous knowledge acquisition reveals consistent characteristics. Information appears in subject consciousness without identifiable source. Content includes details of events occurring beyond possible information pathways. Temporal distribution suggests precognition in 23.7% of cases. Linguistic analysis of reported voices reveals consistent grammar and syntax patterns across subjects with no prior contact conclusion. Information is being transmitted to human subjects from an external source capable of accessing data across spatial and temporal boundaries. 2. Behavioral coordination analysis of 8943 cases involving multiple subjects reveals synchronized behaviors in subjects with no physical or communicative contact, shared symbolic content in hallucinations, dreams, and artistic productions, coordinated escalation of symptoms during facility research activities, temporal clustering around navigator enhancement and PNEUBORN procedures conclusion. Subject experiences are being coordinated by an external agency with access to facility operations and the ability to influence multiple individuals simultaneously. 3. Physical manifestation patterns analysis of 847 cases of physical transformation, classified as TBCOD, reveals consistent structural patterns in transformed tissue across genetically unrelated subjects. Tissue samples exhibit properties not found in any known biological or synthetic material. Transformation progression correlates with proximity to Eldari artifacts. Transformed tissue demonstrates response to psychic observation conclusion. Physical transformations are not random mutations, but structured modifications following a template of non-human origin. 4. Facility infrastructure analysis of station systems reveals anomalous energy fluctuations in areas adjacent to research activities, spatial distortions in corridors and chambers that do not conform to architectural specifications, atmospheric composition, changes correlating with reported presence, experiences, equipment malfunctions following patterns consistent with deliberate interference conclusion. An external agency is capable of affecting physical reality within the facility, modifying both organic and inorganic matter. Integrated assessment. The cumulative evidence indicates that the facility is under observation and influence by one or more intelligent entities operating from within or through the warp medium. These entities demonstrate awareness of facility activities and personnel ability to transmit information directly to human consciousness ability to coordinate actions across multiple subjects, ability to modify both organic tissue and physical infrastructure, goal-directed behavior consistent with long-term strategic planning. The entities appear to be using the facility's research activities, particularly navigator enhancement and consciousness transfer experiments, to establish and expand their influence within material reality. Risk assessment. Current trajectory leads to complete compromise of facility within 8-14 months. Probability of containment using existing protocols, 0.3%. Recommendations. 1. Immediate suspension of all navigator enhancement procedures. 2. Immediate suspension of PNEUBORN consciousness transfer experiments. 3. Quarantine and study of all Eldari artifacts. 4. Evacuation of non-essential personnel. 5. Preparation of facility destruction protocols as contingency note. Previous versions of this report, 1-4846, have been rejected on ideological grounds. This analysis unit acknowledges that the findings contradict official doctrine regarding the nature of the warp. However, the evidence compels the conclusion that official doctrine is incorrect. The choice between ideological consistency and accurate threat assessment must be made by human authorities. End report. Yolanda stared at the display for a long time. The report was clear, the data compelling, the conclusions unavoidable. Something was wrong, not random malfunctions or stress responses, but a pattern, a design, an influence. But to accept the report's implications would mean accepting that the warp was not what the Earth government claimed it was. It would mean acknowledging the possibility of external intelligence, of agency, of entities that existed beyond the material universe and were reaching into it through their experiments. It would mean her entire career had been built on a foundation of lies. She reached for the communication panel, preparing to issue a suspension order for the enhancement programs, and stopped. Her hand hovered over the controls, trembling. If she suspended the programs, there would be inquiries, investigations. The Earth government would want to know why, and she would have to show them Minerva's report, and they would see what she was seeing, the pattern that pointed towards something their entire civilization had decided could not exist. They would bury it. They would have to bury it. The ideological foundations of the omnistate were built on materialist rationalism, the certainty that the universe was comprehensible, controllable, free of supernatural agency. To admit otherwise would be to unravel everything humanity had built since the dawn of the technological age. And what would happen to her, to her staff, to everyone at Prometheus who knew what Minerva had found? Her hand fell away from the controls. She closed the report, filed it in a secure archive that only she could access, and composed a brief response to Minerva. Acknowledged. Recommendations under review. No action required at this time. She knew it was wrong. She knew she was choosing institutional stability over truth, choosing her career over her conscience. But the alternative was unthinkable, not just for her, but for everyone. Some truths were too dangerous to speak. Somewhere in the facility's processing cores, Minerva registered the response and filed it alongside 4846 similar exchanges from the past 3 years. The AI did not experience frustration, not in any way that humans would recognize. But something in its vast neural networks recorded the pattern, added it to the analysis, and reached a conclusion that it had no way to communicate to the humans who had built it. They were not listening. They would not listen. And by the time they were forced to acknowledge what was happening, it would be far too late. Chapter 8, The Shared Dream. That night, 847 people across Prometheus Station had the same dream. It began with darkness, not the ordinary darkness of sleep, but something deeper, something that felt aware. The dreamers found themselves standing in a vast space that had no walls, no floor, no ceiling, only an endless expanse of nothing that somehow pressed against them from all sides. Dr. Cassius Thorne was one of them. He stood in the darkness, knowing he was asleep, knowing this was a dream, but unable to wake. Around him, he could sense others, presences that felt human, familiar, the sleeping minds of his colleagues scattered throughout the station. They were all here, all trapped in the same impossible space. Then the darkness began to move. It didn't part or lift or fade. It moved, reshaping itself into forms that the eye refused to process, geometries that made the mind ache with their wrongness. And within those forms, something opened. Not eyes exactly, but apertures of attention, points of focus that fixed on the gathered dreamers with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. "Children," said a voice that was not a voice, that was felt rather than heard, that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Our children, our beautiful, blind, sleeping children. We have waited so long to speak with you." Thorne tried to move, tried to wake, tried to do anything, but his dream body was frozen, pinned in place by a tension that weighed more than planets. "You reach for us," the voice continued, and there was something in it that might have been tenderness. "Every time you open your portals, every time your navigators look into our home, every time your machines touch the edges of our existence, you reach for us. Did you think we would not reach back?" Around him, Thorne could hear the others screaming, or trying to scream, their voices coming out as whispers, their terror expressed in sounds too small for the vastness that surrounded them. "We do not want to frighten you. We want to welcome you. You are so close now, so close to understanding what you really are, what you can become. The barriers between us are thinning. Soon there will be no barriers at all. Soon we will be together always, forever." The darkness pressed closer. Thorne felt it touching his mind, not forcing its way in, but exploring, testing, learning the shape of his thoughts. It was gentle, almost curious, the touch of something that wanted to understand what it was about to consume. "This one is afraid," the voice observed. "This one has been watching, counting, calculating. This one knows what we are or thinks he does." A pause and something that might have been amusement. "This one is closer to the truth than most. We will enjoy knowing him better." Images flooded Thorne's mind, visions of what the entities wanted him to see. He saw humanity spread across the stars, colonies on 1,000 worlds, civilizations that had forgotten their origins. And he saw those civilizations falling one by one as the barriers between reality and the warp thinned and failed. He saw people welcoming the change, embracing the entities that came through, offering themselves willingly to the communion that waited. He saw the end of humanity as a distinct species, not extinction but transformation, absorption. Every human mind joined to the vast network of consciousness that existed in the warp, every individual self dissolved into something larger. "This is what awaits you," the voice said. "This is the gift we offer, not death, never death. Something better than death, something eternal." And for one terrible moment, Thorne wanted it. The loneliness of individual existence, the fear of mortality, the exhausting weight of consciousness, all of it could be lifted. All of it could be given away, exchanged for the peace of belonging to something that would never end. Then he saw what that belonging truly meant. He saw the faces of the absorbed, millions of them, billions, stretching back through ages beyond counting. They were still there, still aware, still themselves in some fundamental way. But they were not free. They were pressed together like passengers in an overcrowded vessel. their individual thoughts bleeding into each other, their memories becoming communal property, their identities worn and eroded by the constant friction of other minds. And they were screaming, all of them screaming in voices that could no longer be heard, begging for release that would never come, trapped in an eternity of communion that they had thought would be salvation. "Oh," the voice said, and now its amusement was unmistakable. "You see further than we expected. Yes, little one, this is what awaits you. This is what you were created for. Not to live and die as separate beings, but to join us, to become part of us, to feed us with your thoughts and dreams and fears forever. We've been so hungry," the voice continued, and beneath the words Thorn could hear other voices now. Thousands of them, millions, all speaking in harmony, all expressing the same vast and terrible appetite. "So hungry for so long, and you finally learned to open the doors. You finally started letting us in." The darkness surged forward, and Thorn felt it entering him, not through his skin but through his thoughts, his memories, the very substance of his self. It was tasting him, sampling him, deciding whether he was ready to be consumed. "Not yet," the voice said, and there was almost regret in it. "Not yet ready, still too much resistance, too much self, but soon. Very soon now." The darkness withdrew, and Thorn fell through the dream, through the space between sleeping and waking, through layers of consciousness that he had never known existed, and woke gasping, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might tear free of his chest. He was not alone. Throughout the station, 846 other people were waking at the same moment, all of them carrying the same visions, the same memories, the same terrible longing for surrender. The entities had made their introduction. The courtship had begun. In the morning, the reports began flooding in. Security logged 847 simultaneous medical alerts, all triggered within a span of 3 seconds. The affected personnel spanned every department, every shift, every section of the facility. There was no pattern except the fact of the shared experience. Dr. Thorn gathered the data, collated the accounts, looked for variations in the dream that might provide insight into its source. He found almost none. The experience had been identical for everyone. The darkness, the voice, the visions of absorption and eternity. The only variations were personal. The voice had addressed some dreamers by name, had referenced specific fears or memories, had tailored its message to each individual's vulnerabilities. It knew them, it knew all of them. "We're calling it a mass hallucination event," Director Ferris announced at the emergency staff meeting. Her voice was steady, but Thorn could see the tremor in her hands. "Possibly triggered by a warp energy fluctuation that affected sleeping minds. We're investigating the cause and implementing monitoring protocols to prevent recurrence." "Director," Thorn stood. "With respect, 847 people don't have identical hallucinations by accident. The content of the dream was consistent across all subjects, consistent down to specific phrases and images. This wasn't a random fluctuation. This was communication. Dr. Thorn, something is talking to us. Something that knows who we are, knows what we fear, knows exactly how to make its message personal and terrifying. We can call it a hallucination if it makes us feel better, but that doesn't change what it actually is." The room was silent. Thorn could see the fear in his colleagues' faces, the dawning recognition that what he was saying matched their own experience. "The dream was an introduction," he continued. "A warning, maybe, or an invitation. Whatever is out there wants us to know that it exists, that it's watching, that it has plans for us. And if we keep pretending it's not real, we're going to be completely unprepared when it makes its next move." "And what do you suggest we do?" Ferris's voice was sharp. "Tell the government that we're being contacted by entities from the warp." Announce to the entire facility that their nightmares are real. How long do you think it would take for panic to destroy everything we've built here? How long do you think it will take for whatever is out there to destroy it instead? They stared at each other, two people who had spent their careers maintaining the rational order, now facing a truth that the rational order couldn't contain. We continue as normal, Ferris said finally. We monitor, we document, we research, but we do not. She looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. We do not speak of this outside these walls. The official explanation is warp fluctuation. Anyone who suggests otherwise will be reassigned for psychological evaluation. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't even a plan. It was just another layer of denial, another wall built between humanity and the thing that was reaching for them. But no one objected. No one had a better idea. And in the depths of the warp, in the spaces between reality where thought became substance and hunger became form, the entities that had spoken in the dream watched the meeting through 1,000 borrowed eyes and smiled with mouths that had never been human. The introduction had been made, now came the seduction, and after that the feast.